Right now, there is something happening around XRP that most people holding it have completely missed. And if you are one of those investors who think you already understand how this market works, then this information might completely change your perspective because what we are about to discuss is not being talked about enough. And the reality is that nearly 99% of holders are focused only on price, charts, and hype while ignoring the deeper mechanics that actually drive long term value. And that is exactly where the biggest opportunity is quietly building. Most people enter the crypto space with one simple goal, and that is to make quick profits. So naturally, they focus on price movements, daily news, and predictions. But when it comes to Ripple Labs and its ecosystem, the real story is not in the daily price action, but in the infrastructure being built behind the scenes. And this is where many investors fail to pay attention because it is not exciting or viral content, yet it is the foundation that determines whether an asset survives or disappears over time. To understand this properly, you need to shift your mindset from short term trading to long term utility because XRP was not designed just to be another speculative token. It was created to solve a very specific problem in the global financial system. And that problem is cross border payments, which are currently slow, expensive, and inefficient when handled by traditional banking systems. And this is where Ripple's technology comes into play by offering faster settlement times and significantly lower costs compared to legacy systems. Now, here is the part that most holders overlook, and it is the relationship between utility and demand. Because in traditional markets, value is often driven by how useful something is in real world applications. And the same principle applies here. If institutions, banks, and financial networks begin to adopt this technology on a larger scale, then the demand for XRP could increase in a way that most retail investors are not prepared for. And this is not about hype, it is about understanding how financial systems evolve over time. Another important factor that many people ignore is regulation. And this has been one of the biggest challenges and also one of the biggest opportunities for XRP, especially with the involvement of the US Securities and Exchange Commission. Because while many investors see regulation as a threat, experienced market participants understand that regulatory clarity can actually open the doors for institutional money to enter the market. And when large institutions start participating, the scale of capital involved is completely different from retail investors. The ongoing legal situation between Ripple Labs and the US Securities and Exchange Commission has created uncertainty, but at the same time, it has also placed XRP in a unique position where its future could set a precedent for the entire crypto industry. And this is why smart investors are paying close attention, not just to the outcome, but to what it means for the broader adoption of blockchain technology in regulated financial systems. At this point, you might be wondering why this matters to you as a holder. And the answer is simple because the biggest gains in any market usually come from understanding something before the majority catches on. And right now, most people are still focused on short term price movements instead of the bigger picture, which includes institutional adoption, regulatory clarity, and real world use cases. What makes this even more interesting is that while retail investors are distracted by daily fluctuations, major financial players are quietly exploring blockchain solutions and, in some cases, already integrating them into their systems, which means that the groundwork for future growth is being laid right now, even if it is not immediately visible in the price charts. This is the gap between perception and reality, and it is where the biggest opportunities exist. Because when the narrative finally shifts and the majority starts to understand the real value behind XRP, the market reaction could be much stronger than what people expect today. So, the question you need to ask yourself is not whether the price will go up tomorrow or next week, but whether you truly understand what you are holding and why it was created in the first place. Because that knowledge is what separates informed investors from the crowd. And as we move into the next part, we are going to break down an even deeper layer of this topic that most people never even consider. And that is where things start to get really interesting. As we move deeper into this topic, there is another layer that most investors completely ignore, and that is how liquidity actually works behind the scenes. Because when people talk about XRP, they usually focus on price predictions and market hype, but very few take the time to understand how this asset is designed to function inside real financial systems. And this is where the real difference begins to show between those who simply hold and those who truly understand what they are holding. To make this simple, you need to think about how money moves across borders today, because the current system used by banks relies heavily on pre funded accounts in different countries, which means that a bank has to hold money in multiple currencies across the world just to make transactions faster. And this creates a huge inefficiency because that capital is locked and cannot be used elsewhere. And this is exactly the problem that Ripple Labs is trying to solve through its payment solutions. What makes this interesting is the concept of on demand liquidity, which is one of the key technologies behind Ripple's ecosystem. And instead of locking funds in different countries, financial institutions can use XRP as a bridge asset to instantly convert one currency into another, complete the transaction, and settle it within seconds, and then convert it back into the desired currency, which means there is no need to keep large amounts of money sitting idle in foreign accounts. Now, here is the part that most holders do not realize, because if this system continues to grow and more institutions start using it, then the demand for XRP is not just coming from traders or investors, it is coming from actual usage. And that kind of demand behaves very differently from speculative demand because it is tied to real world activity rather than market emotions. And this is one of the strongest foundations for long term value in any asset. Another thing that often goes unnoticed is how scalability plays a role in this entire system, because traditional financial networks struggle with speed and cost when transaction volumes increase. But blockchain based solutions like the one built by Ripple Labs are designed to handle large volumes more efficiently. And this becomes extremely important when you are dealing with global payment networks that process millions of transactions every day. At the same time, there is also a psychological factor in the market that affects how people perceive value, because many investors believe that for a price to increase significantly, it must be driven by hype or sudden news. But in reality, some of the biggest moves happen when strong fundamentals are quietly building over time. And by the time the majority notices, a large part of the move has already happened. And this is why understanding utility and infrastructure is so important. We also need to talk about partnerships and integrations, because this is another area where many people only look at headlines without understanding the deeper impact. As Ripple Labs has worked with various financial institutions and payment providers across different regions, and while not every partnership directly affects the price in the short term, each integration adds another layer to the network, increasing its potential reach and usability over time. What most holders miss is that networks grow in value as they expand. And this is not something that happens overnight, because it requires time, trust, and regulatory alignment. But once a network reaches a certain level of adoption, the growth can accelerate much faster than expected. And this is where early understanding becomes extremely valuable. Another critical point that is often ignored is the difference between holding an asset and understanding its role in a system. Because if you only focus on price, then every small dip feels like a problem. But if you understand how XRP fits into a larger financial structure, then you start to see these movements in a completely different way as part of a bigger process rather than random fluctuations. There is also an important shift happening in the global financial landscape where digital assets are slowly becoming part of mainstream discussions, and institutions are no longer ignoring blockchain technology like they did in the past. And while adoption is still in progress, the direction is becoming clearer over time. And this is something that long term investors pay close attention to. At this stage, it becomes clear that the biggest advantage is not just holding XRP, but understanding why it exists and how it is being positioned in the evolving financial system, because that knowledge allows you to stay focused even when the market becomes uncertain or volatile. And as we move into the next part, we are going to uncover another critical aspect that almost no one talks about, and that is how market structure and supply dynamics can influence the future of XRP in ways that most people are not prepared for. And this is where things start to become even more revealing. As we go even deeper, there is one critical factor that almost no one fully understands, and that is how supply dynamics and market structure can quietly shape the future of XRP, because most investors believe that price is only driven by demand. But the truth is that supply plays an equally powerful role. And when you combine both of these forces together, you begin to see a much clearer picture of what could happen over time. To begin with, you need to understand that XRP is not mined like many other cryptocurrencies, which means the total supply already exists, and a large portion of it has been controlled and managed by Ripple Labs through a structured system. And this has always been a topic of debate in the crypto community because some see it as a risk while others see it as a form of stability. But what most people fail to analyze is how this controlled distribution can influence the market in the long run. Ripple has used an escrow system to lock a significant amount of XRP, releasing a portion of it periodically. And this mechanism is designed to create predictability in supply rather than sudden shocks. And while many retail investors worry that these releases could increase selling pressure, experienced market participants understand that predictable supply is often easier for institutions to work with because it reduces uncertainty and allows for better planning in large scale financial operations. Now, here is where things become even more interesting, because when supply is managed in a structured way and demand begins to grow through real world usage, the balance between these two forces can shift over time. And this is something that does not happen instantly, but when it does, the effects can be significant, especially in a market where liquidity and accessibility play a major role. Another aspect that most holders overlook is how market structure itself affects price behavior. Because the crypto market is still relatively young compared to traditional financial markets. And this means it is more sensitive to sentiment, speculation, and external events. But as regulation improves and institutional participation increases, the structure of the market begins to change. And this can lead to more stability as well as more sustained growth over time. This is why the involvement of regulatory bodies like the US Securities and Exchange Commission is so important, because while many people see regulation as a limitation, it can actually create a framework that allows larger players to enter the market with confidence. And when institutions feel secure enough to participate, the scale of capital that enters the system can be far greater than what retail investors alone can provide. At the same time, there is also the factor of market psychology, which plays a huge role in how prices move in the short term, because fear and excitement often drive decisions more than logic. And this is why you often see sharp movements in both directions, even when the underlying fundamentals have not changed. And this creates opportunities for those who understand the difference between temporary sentiment and long term value. Another important point to consider is how liquidity flows within the market, because large movements in price are often connected to how easily an asset can be bought or sold without causing major changes in its value. And as more institutions begin to use XRP for actual transactions, the liquidity of the asset can improve, making it more efficient and attractive for larger scale use. What most people do not realize is that when an asset becomes more liquid and widely used, it can also become more stable over time. And this stability is something that institutions prefer because it reduces risk and makes it easier to integrate into existing financial systems. And this is another reason why utility driven demand is so different from purely speculative interest. There is also a long term perspective that many investors fail to adopt because they expect immediate results, but markets do not always move in a straight line. And sometimes the most important developments happen during periods when price action seems quiet or even disappointing. And this is where patience becomes one of the most valuable qualities an investor can have. When you combine all of these factors together, including controlled supply, growing utility, evolving market structure, and increasing regulatory clarity, you begin to see that the future of XRP is not determined by a single event or announcement, but by a series of developments that build on each other over time. And this is exactly what most holders fail to recognize. As we move into the next part, we are going to explore another dimension that is often misunderstood, and that is the role of global financial trends and how they can influence the adoption and value of XRP in ways that go far beyond the crypto market itself. And this is where the bigger picture starts to come into focus. As we expand the view even further, it becomes clear that the future of XRP is not only connected to what is happening inside the crypto market, but also deeply influenced by global financial trends that are reshaping how money moves around the world. And this is something that most holders rarely pay attention to because they are focused only on charts and short term predictions, while the real transformation is happening at a much larger scale. To understand this properly, you need to look at how the global financial system is evolving because countries, banks, and institutions are actively exploring faster and more efficient ways to transfer value across borders. And this is where digital assets and blockchain technology start to play a more important role, especially in a world where speed, cost efficiency, and transparency are becoming essential requirements rather than optional features. One of the biggest shifts happening right now is the growing interest in digital currencies issued by governments, often referred to as central bank digital currencies. And while these are different from cryptocurrencies, they still rely on similar underlying technologies. And this creates an environment where blockchain based solutions become more accepted over time, indirectly supporting the infrastructure that assets like XRP are built on. At the same time, global payment networks are under pressure to improve because traditional systems are not designed for instant settlement. And this creates delays and additional costs that affect both businesses and individuals. And as international trade continues to grow, the demand for faster payment solutions increases, and this is exactly the type of problem that Ripple Labs has been trying to solve with its technology. Another important factor that often goes unnoticed is the role of large financial institutions and how their strategies can influence the direction of the market. Because when major players begin to explore or adopt new technologies, it sends a strong signal to the rest of the industry, and this can accelerate the pace of adoption in ways that are not immediately visible to retail investors. There is also the element of competition because XRP is not the only asset aiming to improve cross border payments. And understanding this competitive landscape is important if you want to have a realistic view of its future. But what makes XRP stand out is its focus on working with existing financial systems rather than trying to replace them entirely. And this approach can make adoption smoother because it aligns with how institutions currently operate. What most holders fail to realize is that integration is often more powerful than disruption because systems that can connect with existing infrastructure have a higher chance of being adopted at scale. And this is a key advantage that Ripple Labs has been working towards by building partnerships and developing solutions that fit into current financial frameworks. Another layer to consider is how geopolitical and economic changes can influence the adoption of new financial technologies. Because when countries face challenges related to currency stability, trade efficiency, or financial access, they become more open to alternative solutions. And this creates opportunities for blockchain based systems to demonstrate their value in real world scenarios. There is also a growing trend towards financial digitization where everything from payments to asset management is moving into digital environments. And this shift is not happening overnight, but it is consistent and long term. And as this transformation continues, the demand for technologies that support fast and reliable value transfer is likely to increase, which directly connects to the core purpose of XRP. At this stage, it becomes clear that the potential growth of XRP is not just about crypto market cycles, but about how well it fits into the future of global finance. And this is a much bigger narrative than most people are considering because it involves changes at the level of institutions, governments, and international systems. What makes this even more important is that these global trends move slowly at first and then accelerate. And this means that by the time the majority of investors fully understand what is happening, a significant portion of the opportunity may already be gone. And this is why awareness and understanding at an early stage can make a major difference. As we move into the final part, everything we have discussed so far will come together, and we are going to look at what this actually means for you as a holder, including the risks, the realistic expectations, and the most important mindset you need to have if you want to navigate this space with clarity, because this is where most people make their biggest mistakes and also where the smartest decisions are made. Now that everything has been laid out clearly, the most important question is what all of this actually means for you as someone holding or thinking about holding XRP, because information alone does not create results. It is the way you understand and act on that information that truly makes the difference. And this is exactly where most people go wrong in this market without even realizing it. The first thing you need to accept is that the crypto market, including XRP, does not move in a straight line. And expecting constant upward movement is one of the biggest mistakes that many investors make, because even the strongest assets go through periods of uncertainty, corrections, and slow growth. And these phases are often misunderstood as weakness when in reality they are part of a larger cycle that allows the market to build strength over time. What separates informed investors from the majority is not just what they buy, but how they think during these phases. Because when prices drop or move sideways, most people react emotionally, they panic, they lose confidence, and they start questioning their decisions. But those who understand the fundamentals behind XRP are able to stay focused on the bigger picture rather than getting distracted by short term noise. At the same time, it is also important to stay realistic, because while there is a lot of excitement and bold predictions in the market, not all of them are based on facts. And believing that any asset will reach extremely high prices in a short period without strong supporting factors can lead to poor decision making. And this is why balance is key. You need to stay open to opportunities, but also grounded in logic and research. Another critical point is risk management, because no matter how strong a project appears, there are always risks involved, including regulatory changes, market volatility, competition, and broader economic conditions. And ignoring these risks is one of the fastest ways to make costly mistakes. So instead of putting all your focus on potential gains, you also need to consider how much risk you are willing to take and how you can manage it effectively. There is also the concept of patience, which is often talked about but rarely practiced. Because in a fast moving digital world, everyone wants quick results. But when it comes to assets that are connected to long term infrastructure and global financial systems, growth takes time. And this is something that many holders struggle with, especially when they compare their expectations with short term market movements. What makes this journey even more challenging is the constant flow of information, because every day there are new headlines, opinions, and predictions, and not all of them are accurate or useful. So, learning how to filter information becomes a very important skill. And instead of following every piece of news, it is better to focus on key developments related to Ripple Labs regulation and real world adoption. Another thing you should always keep in mind is that markets reward those who are prepared, not those who react late, because by the time something becomes obvious to everyone, the biggest opportunity is often already behind. And this is why understanding the deeper aspects of XRP, including its utility, supply structure, and role in the financial system, gives you an advantage that most people do not have. At this point, everything connects together, from utility and liquidity to global trends and market psychology, and it becomes clear that the future of XRP depends on multiple factors working together over time rather than a single event or announcement. And this is exactly why long term awareness is more powerful than short term excitement. So instead of asking when the price will suddenly increase, a better question to ask is whether the foundation is getting stronger, because that is what truly drives sustainable growth. And if you can focus on that, you will be in a much better position than the majority of holders who are only chasing quick results without understanding the bigger picture. Before we end, it is important to remember that none of this should be taken as financial advice, because the crypto market carries risk and every individual situation is different. So you should always do your own research and make decisions based on your own understanding and financial goals, and never invest money that you cannot afford to lose. If you found this breakdown useful and want to stay updated with deeper insights like this, make sure you stay connected for more content, because understanding is your biggest advantage in this market. And the more you learn, the better decisions you will be able to make over time.